So today I'm going to talk about the French Revolution. It's going to be quite a short summary because, of course, the French Revolution is a whole deal. It's just one of the most interesting parts of history, and it's one of my favorite periods. And yeah, here it goes. Well, first of all, we have to look at what the causes were, because you can't really examine a historical event without knowing what caused it. Well, first of all, France had been actively involved in the American Revolution of the 18th century. They'd given them guns and ships and a lot of aid, so they had spent quite a lot of money on this. This was both Louis XVI and his predecessor, which, if I'm not mistaken, could be Louis XV, but don't hold me to that because I may be wrong. I don't know the French monarchs. But yeah, Louis XVI helped spend a lot of money on the American cause, and it did pay off because the Americans won, but this left the country practically bankrupt. It just left the country with practically no money. Poverty was made even worse, and the situation was not good. Furthermore, there would be a lot of poor harvests. It's not that the spending on the American Revolution had emptied the royal purse. It's not like it's just the spending on the American Revolution had damaged the economy. Poor harvests, poor weather, disease, and inflation of the economy, which had been rising quite fast, not natural inflation amounts, more like not hyperinflation, but quite rapidly. And of course, those who were poor, those peasants, were just, okay, no, first of all, why are you spending money on the Americans when you should be spending money on us? And second of all, why are you not spending money on us? We're your subjects. We should be the priority. Well, by the fall of 1786, this guy who was who controlled he was a general in Louis XVI's army, and yeah, he was just a general called Charles Alexandre de Calonne. So that these people were starting to cause riots, were starting to loot, were actively going against the taxes imposed by the French government, that he thought, hey, let's organize some financial reform packages, including a land tax that would also include the higher classes, because that was the problem with the French Revolution. That was the problem with the French society, because the poor were made to pay taxes, but the upper classes weren't. So that obviously upset the lower classes, and he said, okay, fine, let's make everyone pay the same amount, or a universal tax. Everyone, no one is exempted from this. And yeah, it did seem a good idea at the time, because it's not just the poor paying, it's also the rich. But yeah. Of course, Calonne, he knew that the upper classes would not be happy. And yeah, they would be fine with having the lower classes being taxed. But not them, they should be exempted. God knows why, but hey. So he counseled the king to summon the Estates General, or in French, les États Généraux. Pardon my French, it's terrible. So it was this assembly that represented the clergy, the nobility, and the middle class. And it had been assembled for the first time since 1614. And mind you, this is 1786, it's way over 150 years for this. Well, this meeting was, these reforms were implemented in 1786, but the meeting was scheduled to take place on the 5th of May, 1789, which would give time for delegates of the three states to present a list of grievances called the Cahiers de doléances, again, pardon my French, and they would present them to the king. Now, problem with the States General is that there were three votes. One for the clergy, one for the nobility, and one for the third estate. Of course, the clergy and the nobility would be more wealthy, so there was something that would damage the wealthy, they would veto it. There was something that would make the third estate pay, they would allow it. And because they just needed 2 votes to pass, it was hard for the third estate to actually pass something through. So the third estate started rising. And from 1614 to 1789, the third estate now had a huge amount of power. They formed 98% of the French population. So they couldn't exactly be ignored. And I just said, they could still be outvoted by the clergy and the nobility, but they should be represented, and that's what the people felt. They thought, hey, why aren't we being represented? Why are our policies being vetoed when we're the majority? Then all this happened, and then all these problems came up on the estate's general meeting. Now, the third estate said, hey, why don't we, crazy idea, I know, crazy, why don't we just push for equal representation and remove the veto? So why don't we, instead of voting by status, we just vote by heads? The state with the most people should be the state with the most votes, right? The king, the nobility, and the clergy were like, no, why would we do that? And yeah, all of the 3 groups did want a fiscal and judicial reform, but nobles were like, yeah, that is all good and all, yeah, reforms, yay, but I don't want to give up my privileges. I'm really happy with this, and this traditional system is all good, so just let me live, and you can just stay there. And the third estate's like, no, no, we want reform. And then came the famous tennis court oath. So by the time the Estates General actually convened at Versailles, so there was a huge public debate over the voting process. And this had gone away from the Estates General. Normal people, educated people, knew what was happening and were discussing it. And now it was more about who had the power rather than the individual men who actually passed things. It was more debate on the hostility between the orders, how the third estate wasn't as represented. On June 17th, so 1789, the Estates General met and adopted the title of National Assembly, which was, completely made up of people from the third estate, and would meet 3 days later on the 20th of June in a tennis court. It's indoor, and made an oath. Obviously, the tennis court oath. Let me just try to say this in French. I'm sorry, it's going to be terrible. But the serment du jeu de paume. And yeah, there was this oath, and what this oath asked, well, they said, we're not going to disperse, we are not going to leave the political situation until a change happens. So yeah, take your time, we're just going to be here, we're going to be waiting, so chop. Well, a lot of the clergy saw this and said, hey, let's just, fine. So most of the clergy joined them, and even 47 liberal nobles joined them, including a famous Marquis de Lafayette, who was a key figure in the American Revolution. And on June 27th, so exactly 1 week after the National Assembly had met in the tennis court, and 10 days after the National Assembly had been formed, King Louis said, fine, we will form a new type of assembly, a new type of order, and you will all be equally represented. Great. And that is the story of the French Revolution. No, you'd think, but no. Then it comes to hold the Bastille and the Great Fear. Now, this was back in, this was in June 12th, I think. Where they were working on the National Constituent Assembly. It wasn't formally established yet. They were meeting at Versailles, this was all good, but down in Paris, it was chaos. Of course, they didn't know, and Versailles is around 40 minutes away from Paris by train, and when this was happening, the people in Paris didn't know what they were discussing. They had no idea. So they consumed the capital. They just violence, fear, revolts. Paris was in chaos. There was a breakdown of royal power when all this happened, and they thought, hey, this is our chance. We should just do something about it, right? Hell yeah. They thought, fine, yes, this is good, more for reform. But someone thought, hey, I've said that quite a lot of times now, but hey, what if someone organizes a military coup? What if we just broke down slightly the power of the monarchy, and someone comes in and just plants a dictatorship, a military dictatorship? We don't want that, do we? So they thought, yeah, we don't want that. So on July 14th, they stormed the Bastille. It was a fortress, a prison, and their aim was to not only destroy the symbol of the aristocracy, but also to gain gunpowder, weapons, and this formally establishes the start of the French Revolution. Now, this wave of hysteria and revolution started spreading across the country, and people who had been under this wing of exploitation suddenly started looting their owners, suddenly started burning the homes of tax collectors, and just disrespecting the elite. They thought, hey, we are not under your control anymore. We are doing a revolution. So, hey, check it. We're the ones in power now. And this is the Great Fear. So the Bastille was the actual storming of the Bastille, and then the Great Fear was this period. And yeah, then all this happened, and the National Constituent Assembly saw this and said, we gotta do something about it. So they tried to abolish feudalism on August 4th, 1789, which was essentially the death certificate of the old order, because it just signified how there was a change, and feudalism had been a nation's style of economic policy, and it had been abolished. So it was a change from the old to the new. Well, that'll happen, and now I'm going to talk to you about the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Well, this was in August, and then later that August, the Assembly thought, hey, let's just adopt the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Let me just try this in French. I'm sorry, it's very terrible, but Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen. Yeah, I'm sorry, my French accent is terrible, but hey, it's the French Revolution. I gotta speak some French. Well, it was just based on the ideas of Enlightenment and Rousseau. It was an idea of democratic principles, of how they wanted the third estate and others to have equal representation. So, like I said before, more of a by head rather than by social order. It allowed the assembly to replace this ancient form of government and create one based on opportunity, freedom of speech, representative government, essentially what we think of now as a democratic government. So they wanted to establish go from an autocracy to a democratic government. That's all they wanted to do. They wanted equal representation. That's it. So there was a constitution, essentially. It's kind of like the Declaration of Independence in the U.S., but not really. But you know what I'm saying? Like, it's similar. So don't say that this was essentially the Declaration of Independence. It was another declaration similar to a constitution. Anyway, it wasn't really easy because they also had to keep legislature functioning. I mean, the king was still in power, but now a lot of power had fallen into the National Assembly, so they just had to balance it. And making all these changes as well as managing the country effectively was kind of hard. It was kind of hard, and they didn't really know how to handle it, so they struggled. So, of course, this was the first, like, no other country had this kind of government. And yeah, the US had just established this, but it was really young. I mean, the first president had been inaugurated that same year, 1789, George Washington. But this is really, really new. So, for example, who would appoint new delegates? Who would, would the clergy be involved in the French government since they are just part of the Catholic Church? Should we let them? What about the king? Can we allow the king to live? Can we allow the king to like continue staying there? Because the king saw this and he knew his dad was in danger and left, tried to flee the country in June 1781, but got caught. Of course, the idea of government of a parliamentary monarchy exists. For example, in Spain, right now we have a king, but also we have parliament. In the UK, there's a queen and parliament. So it's not an abstract idea. It does exist. But right then they're like, do we let the king stay, or do we imprison him? Do we kill him? What do we do? And this is the point in which it starts getting a bit radical. On September 3rd, 1791, the official first French constitution was adopted, and it established a constitutional monarchy. Like I said, kind of similar, but not really, to the UK style of government now and the Spanish style of government. The king could still veto stuff, could still appoint ministers, but there was a bit. I mean, the National Assembly had a lot more power than they had just had before. This guy called Maximilien de Robespierre, along with George de Mouly and Georges Dassin, thought, no, not enough. No, I don't like it. I want more radical. So they started drumming up support for the more Republican style of government and a trial for the king. So rather than a constitutional monarchy, a parliamentary monarchy, he said just republic. He wanted a republic. And it does make sense. I mean, nowadays, a lot of countries are a republic. And the US, a recently formed country back then, was a republic. And so far, they're functioning okay. So let's just get rid of the king and establish a republic. So in April 1792, there were new elections, and instead of being called the National Assembly, it was called the Legislative Assembly. They declared war on Austria and Prussia, which, I mean, it was believed that some of the old French elites were trying to build up support against revolution. So, apart from like stopping any counter-revolution from happening, also spreading the thoughts of the revolution. And it just shows how, by this point, the Legislative Assembly could assemble an army and declare war. Something which a year before, or even 5 years before, they couldn't have done. It shows how, to what extent the power of the people rose during the first years of the revolution. However, now this group of Jacobins, these were extremists, and they stormed the capital. They went into the royal residence in Paris, and they arrested the king. Now, those in the legislative assembly, they did want to keep the king imprisoned or at least controlled. Of course, these people, the Jacobins, said no, we want more radical things. But yeah, this was way more radical, and this just led to more violence in the streets of Paris. There was violence, insurrections, massacres. Like there was these insurrections in Paris ended up killing hundreds of accused counter-revolutionaries. Then you know how I said the National Assembly turned into the Legislative Assembly. Well, it was now the National Convention, which said, okay, you know how we set up this constitutional monarchy? Yeah, all nice, perfect, perfect. We like this. Well, we actually don't like it, and we are going to officially abolish the monarchy, and we're going to set up a republic. Okay? And that's what they did in 1792. The arrest of the king was on the 10th of August, and soon after this was when the monarchy was officially abolished. Now, a few months later, on January 21st, 1793, King Louis XVI was officially condemned to death for high treason and crimes against the state through the guillotine. Now, the guillotine was one of the most efficient ways of execution used up until 1977. So, by the time the first Star Wars movie came out, the guillotine was still being used in France. No, I mean, it stopped in 1977, but just for context. The guy, his name was Guillotine, that's where the structure gets its name. Rather than to achieve painless death, it was really quick. It just put the guy in, or the girl, whatever. Put the person in with their hands behind, and just have a basket ready and cut their head off. And it was then you just need to move the body, and then the next person, really quick. And I mean, relatively painless, but also allowed for less glory, I guess. I mean, just execution. And it was perfect for the execution of the king, because he was just executed like many of normal Parisians, showing how the king was just another person now, no important political figure. Marie Antoinette, she suffered the same fate just 9 months later. Marie Antoinette was kind of one of the reasons the monarchy fell, because whilst France was in chaos and really suffering, Marie Antoinette kept on with her wigs and fancy dresses and spending. And yeah. And when after all this happened, the Reign of Terror took over France. Now, of course, European powers and divisions within the actual National Convention thought, okay, fine, you know what? This was all good and all. We should stop there and end the revolution because we killed the king. Voila. Yeah, no, they wanted more. They wanted more violence, more radical change. So, in June 1793, the Jacobins, the group that arrested the king, seized the National Convention, and which was controlled by the moderate Girondins, and said, hey, we are now going to install a series of radical measures, and we are going to install a new calendar and officially eradicate Christianity. Because we're like that. Yes, that's just what they did. And they unleashed a period of 10 months called the Reign of Terror, La Terreur, in which any enemy of the revolution was guillotined by the thousands. So if you said anything that would strike Robespierre, who was the leader, your head would be kind of just like that. Because it was against the revolution and you needed to obey the revolution. And c'est la vie, you know. It was all basically under the orders of Robespierre, although he wasn't the only guy who actually commanded the executions. And he dominated this draconian Committee of Public Safety, which was the name. Until at one point, some people said, "Hey, guy, Robespierre, can we stop now? Because I think we are executing too many people, and we should stop." Robespierre's like, "No, I think we're doing fine. I'm happy. We need to kill more people." And the normal people said, "Oh, it's like that? Yeah, sure." And Robespierre ended up being guillotined himself. So he ended up suffering the fate he had sent many to suffer. Yeah, his head was cut off because he was too radical. And there is a limit, On the 28th of July, 1794. The Reign of Terror started in June 1793 and ended in July 1794. It didn't start in June 1793, but it's almost a year, 10 months. It's really crazy. Like, imagine living in France, in Paris, especially in Paris, although this was happening all over the country during this time. Well, when Robespierre died, this period called the Thermidorian reaction started. More like it was basically people saying, "Hey, can this reign of terror stop now? We can be more moderate. We abolish the monarchy. There's no danger anymore. Can we just calm down, guys?" And then the French Revolution ended. I'm going to talk about this in a bit. And this guy ended up rising called Napoleon. I don't know if you heard of him. Really insignificant general. Didn't really do much. Yeah, I'm going to talk about it just now. Well, on the 22nd of August, 1795, way over a year after Robespierre's execution, this National Convention, composed of the Girondins who actually survived the Reign of Terror, approved this constitution that said, "Hey, let's just have a bicameral legislature, and also instead of having this one assembly, you can be two. It's bicameral essentially. So rather than power concentrated in one place, it can be delegated into two. Well, executive power would lie in the hands of a 5-member directory, the Directoire, which was appointed by Parliament. So Parliament did have a lot of power. It was a republic at this point, so. The Royalists and the Jacobins said that, "Hey, we don't like this," because the Royalists wanted the king back, the Jacobins wanted the Reign of Terror and Robespierre back. So these people were like, no, we want it back. Can you please change it back? Of course, they didn't. Now, they gave them the support, enough support to call the army. So the National Convention said, "Hey, here's the army, shut up now." One of the leading commanders was this really young guy, really successful general called Napoleon Bonaparte. But this one, he was a good general, successful, but essentially a nobody, because nobody in terms of wider political knowledge. I mean, in the army he was. So that happened, and the Directory went on to stay there for 4 years in power, and they did have quite a few problems. It's not that the French Revolution happened and it was all downhill from there. No, they had a lot of financial crises, like the king had rather than the king under this new government. It was popular discontent. People weren't happy with this. Apart from those who wanted more radical change, normal people were like, "You were supposed to bring prosperity? Yeah, where is it? Can you please give us our prosperity, please?" And of course, as with almost any government ever, corruption. Corruption was a real problem, and it didn't end with the execution of the monarch. It just didn't end. So by the end of the 1790s, these directors from the directory, they just relied on the military. So remember that time I said that, hey, what if people take advantage of the military and they stage a military coup? Well, that was a real danger at this point, because it hadn't happened in 1789, but it kind of happened in 1799, so 10 years later. It did come true, just 10 years after. So, I mean, the government was really relying on the military, and on the 9th of March, 1799, Bonaparte said, I've had enough. You're relying on us, and we don't get that much in return, so the military is now going to take over. We're going to stage a coup d'etat, and we're going to basically take over France, which they did. So the Directory was abolished because you guys don't do what I want, so I'm going to remove you, shoo, and I'm now going to be France's first consul. And think of Napoleon, just think of the guy with the hand in his jacket. He was France's first consul, officially ending the French Revolution and beginning the Napoleonic era, which ended up dominating France. France ended up dominating Europe. So yeah, that is the French Revolution. That is it. I mean, there is a lot more to uncover, but this is just a quick summary. And yeah, it lasted from 1789 to 1799. That's just the end, right at the end of the 18th century. And it just went through quite a few phases. Think about it. It's just the States General, then the Tennis Court Oath, then the Bastille, then the Reign of Terror, and then kind of calm, and then Napoleon. So living in Paris, like France in general, but especially Paris during this time, cannot have been easy. There were a lot of things going on. So yeah, that is the French Revolution. If you want to hear more on Napoleon or more on certain aspects of the revolution, let me know. And yeah, otherwise that would be it. Thank you for watching.